All right, so today we have basically our podcast regular guest here on the topic of AI risk mitigation. Andrew Burt, managing partner at Luminos.Law, the first law firm that specializes in, AI and analytics risk management. Let me read back to you, Andrew, what's on your website. We help the world's largest and most innovative businesses manage the privacy, fairness, and security and transparency of their AI and data, including generative AI systems. And so today, I thought it would be a good idea to bring Andrew back and just kind of get an update on the state of risk and compliance in light of generative AI. And if you're interested in these topics, make sure to check out our conference in San Francisco in September 26 and 27. And you can find more details at aiconference.com. So, Andrew, welcome back to the Data Exchange podcast.
Thank you. Always fun to be here.
So, and for our listeners who are following this on YouTube, I am actually sharing some slides with Andrew just to guide our discussion. But obviously, you don't need that for the purposes of following along in our conversation. So first things first. I think we've talked a lot about risk and challenges posed by AI, and perhaps there's some new risks posed by generative AI. You and I are kind of deeper in this topic than others, so we're kind of aware of these risks. So what are you hearing from chief legal counsels? How much education do you need to provide at this point? And is a lot of your conversations these days around generative AI and LLMs?
Yeah, so I would say 6 months ago, it's interesting how fast this moves. About 6 months ago, probably 20% of our work was related to generative AI. Now I'd say 60, 70, some days maybe 80%. People who were focused on AI in honestly across all different kinds of enterprises are increasingly focused on generative AI, and there's just this like mad rush to adopt generative AI systems. And one of the things I will say that's been really interesting is that while we're a law firm, which means we interact with general counsels and chief legal officers, and we're also made up of data scientists, so we interact with data scientists as well. It has kind of become apparent in the last 6 or so months that everyone needs education on risk management for generative AI systems. So what we find ourselves doing really over and over again for many of our clients is we educate the lawyers on all of the things that can go wrong, and then all of the different things you should be doing to prevent it. Or prevent is a strong word. You can't prevent generative AI systems from going wrong. They're high risk. What you can do is you can minimize and you can reduce those risks, and you can monitor them so that you can identify them when they occur. So we're educating lawyers about this. But then to the same extent, we're also educating data scientists, engineers, information security people. We're helping them red team and test the models. For whatever reason, data scientists and the world of data science has done a huge amount in terms of developing these systems, but not actually that much in minimizing and managing their risks.
So I guess to some extent, so there's variety of techniques for mitigating risks in generative AI and LLMs. And would you say that most people know some of the things to do, but not all of them? And then the secondary question is, what's the level of urgency in terms of testing?
So I think in terms of urgency for testing, well, so there's a really big difference. We talk about this all the time. There is a difference between getting rid of risks and reducing those risks. And so we see a lot, particularly technical personnel, they think that if they're testing, that means that they have to get rid of any of the risks in LLMs. And that's just not possible at all. And so I'm going to call it the game. That's the wrong word.
So Andrew, first of all, I guess people must know when it is suitable, right? So what use cases? So I guess kind of the classic line is if the answer changes tomorrow and you don't care as much, maybe this technology is appropriate. But if the answer changes tomorrow and that's a showstopper, that might be. So in other words, so do they even know what use cases to tackle?
Well, so all right, so I have a couple thoughts there, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to give them in order, but so one of the things that is the most challenging about generative AI systems, from a legal perspective, is it's very hard to figure out the context they're going to be used in. And so for foundational models, let's say, they're kind of turning the paradigm for how you think about risk on its head, because very frequently you don't actually know how it's going to be used. And when you talk about a use case, it's frequently that use case comes as a result of fine tuning or whatever it is. And so the question is, when are you testing, and what specifically are you testing? And so for us, for what we tend to see is there are data science teams that are focused on both creating or adopting foundational models and then the fine tuning. But then it's really product teams that end up incorporating them into products that are user facing. And so there's this there's a line between them. And so when the data scientists are doing the testing, it is very rare for them to know exactly what the use case is. And so that creates all sorts of issues. And then I'll just say, even once you do know the use case, which in our experience is rare for data scientists, because these systems are probabilistic and they're trained, many of them are trained on data that's limited in time, like you said, it's hard to know if their answers are reliable, not just like hallucinatory, but are they reliable? You're going to get the same.
I mean, so these are models that are somewhat creative, right? So this is the whole notion of if you care that the answer changes, then maybe this type of approach may not be for you. By the way, so as you're talking there, it seems to me that there's got to be more attention paid to, I guess, how you organize these teams, right? So in other words, this distinction between the people who develop, train, and fine-tune the model, pass it over the wall to people who will use it, that might not work anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you one example of one of the problems we see over and over again, which is that there are all sorts of types of disclosures that are becoming required for these systems. So like if you're interacting with the system, certain things it's best practice to have in, let's say, the UI. And more we're seeing data scientists say, we have no control over what goes in the UI. We don't know about it. It's not us. So we can't even think about the relationship between those disclosures and the model. And that, of course, poses a big issue if you're asking data scientists to test to try to figure out, what the user experience might be. If you're trying to ask them to understand the risks, it's very hard. It's really kind of completely bifurcated, and that causes real issues. I mean, that being said, there is a reason for it. There tend to be way fewer data scientists in practice and a lot more product people. So sometimes we see kind of data scientists embedded into product teams. But for most of our clients that are adopting generative AI, they are embedding it into a huge number of products, and there just aren't enough data scientists. There just aren't enough data scientists to be on every single product team. So I understand why it happens, but it definitely creates a bunch of issues in practice.
And this also comes at a time when there's a clear trend towards these decentralized custom foundation models, right? So in other words, I'm not going to rely on OpenAI or some external service. I want a foundation model that's trained in-house or fine-tuned or supported by my own vector database or knowledge graph. So in other words, so there's going to be a lot of movement towards customization, which means you really do need people to work together throughout this process. And by the way, I have a slide here that may make you laugh, but I took the 16 or 17 pages of questions from the FTC to OpenAI and turned it into this mind map. And so you can see the level of detail of questions, which goes, Andrew, to what we're talking about. So there's a lot of questions about personnel, right? So do you have people who's in charge of legal and compliance, right? And so on and so forth. So it seems to me that, if I look at this mind map from those questions from FTC to OpenAI, that more attention should be paid upfront to how you organize these teams, right?
Yeah, so I think, it's interesting. All right, so for listeners who are not familiar with it, the FTC 2-3 weeks ago released what it calls a civil investigative demand, CID, to OpenAI, which basically means that, like, as a regulatory agency, we're interested in what you're doing and maybe you did something wrong. And so they sent this really long document to OpenAI, basically saying we're investigating you guys. And so it's really a milestone in the regulatory oversight of
generative AI. Which is 17 pages of questions, which I converted into this mind map, but I'm not even sure if I captured everything. But this mind map is already complicated, right?
Yeah, I think this is good. Just the one thing I'll say is the FTC document, they clearly threw, the kitchen sink at this. They put, I think, everything. It was not, what's the best way to put it? It's not so concise. And I'm not sure, this was like the first kind of volley and regulators looking into these systems. So I expect over time, like, this mind map to be a little bit less chaotic. Like, there's just a lot going on here. But what I will say is the takeaway from this is that teams that are involved in generative AI and companies that are involved in deploying or adopting these systems, they need to have clear documentation in many of these categories so that when they deploy or they fine tune or whatever it is, the generative AI system, they understand what's in the system, how the user experience is going to be in relationship to the system, who interacted with it. Like, there's just some basic things that need to be documented. And that's basically what the FTC is asking for.
Andrew, if you look at this mind map, nothing specifically generative AI about this, right? So maybe you could say this is true for every AI system, but I think that there's nothing specifically that only limits this mind map to LLMs, but clearly they are more concerned about LLMs.
I mean, everyone is focused on generative AI systems, regulators and lawmakers and companies in the private sector. What I will say, it's interesting. We've talked about this before, like, getting documentation clear for AI systems is just the most important way. It's the most efficient way. It's the most impactful way to manage their risks, AI writ large. That's still true for LLMs and generative AI systems. And it is interesting that nothing in these categories is specific to generative AI. From what I remember of the complaint, which sadly I have printed on my desk because I've had to spend so much time with it for our clients, there are some questions in there that are specific to LLMs, fine tuning. I can't remember what else, but you're right. This is pretty generic, and any company looking at this should be thinking, how do I take these categories and just make sure I have basic answers to each of these questions for all my AI systems?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and you can see, so for some of these categories, I have kind of explanations, and they're clearly LLM specific, lifted from the document, right? So, but there's things in here that may surprise people, like, for example, companies' public relations, right? So how do you talk about, disclose, or represent your LLM? In many ways, that should apply to every AI system, but clearly it's not the case that people talk about their recommender or fraud detection system, or right? So
let me just give you some context, because that one, There's actually something very specific that's going on there. I don't know if this is too detailed for folks, but I don't want to say like the regulatory system I'll say the regulatory system in the US doesn't make a lot of sense for AI. It's split up across different sectors. And then the kind of general regulators that have power across sectors don't have the best laws to work with. So the FTC regulates just like commerce in general. And the reason why that company PR is on there is because the only real tool, the strongest tool they have in their toolbox here, is to police unfair and deceptive acts. And so what they're really looking at there, because that's the law they're enforcing, is basically, are people lying? Are companies lying? Are they misrepresenting the capabilities? That's really in the US where the FTC is going to be able to like exert the most authority. And so that's really what they're looking for. And I'll just say it's pretty awkward, and lawmakers know this, and that's why there are lots of discussions going on in Washington about how to improve the FTC's powers, strengthen them, what new laws need to be on the books. But that specifically, that's really what the FTC that's where their power is the strongest. And so what they're looking for are companies exaggerating the capabilities of these systems. Are they promising that the answers will be true? Are they hiding the fact that users are interacting with a generative AI system? So those are the things where it's like the clearest that they have the power to go after it. Other stuff here is it's a little grayer.
Yeah, and so the box around risk assessment and safety seems like the classic category that we've been talking about, right? So this might be something that people, for the most part, are doing something in this category. Third-party relations, this has to do with how people are accessing your model, especially now that these models are accessible by an API. There might be all sorts of plugins. Yeah, so especially now that the model seems to be people will use a variety of these models and chain together applications. So you don't know how, in many ways, as the model provider, you may not know how your model is being used.
I mean, that's the big problem, is how do you manage risks in these systems when you don't actually know how they're going to be used? In the EU, that has been a gigantic thorn in their side. And it's a huge problem. And also, I'd say for here, the focus here is clearly on how are third parties using your software. But like you said, the architecture, the way these systems are strung together, where the data comes from, it's very rare for any single party to develop these systems, kind of soup to nuts. So there are always third-party and dependencies involved. And that makes things really, really complicated. And so I'll just say with our clients who are struggling with these issues, some of whom are like subject to these types of this type of oversight, it's just an absolute mess. It's an absolute mess. There's so many different moving pieces, and even the best, most well-resourced actors are really struggling to keep up.
And then there's a box here, mitigating false and misleading statements, which I guess is hallucination. And hallucination obviously is something that people have long worried about, these LLMs and generative AI systems. But to some extent, all models hallucinate, right? So they can give you wrong recommendations, or search rankings can be gained by some SEO company, and this I think there's a whole industry around that. But I think these models in particular are prone to generate a response even when they don't have the right information.
I mean, the question, so we see clients struggle with this all the time. The question is really like, what is the value of the AI system? How are users extracting value from them? And in this case, with generative AI systems, it's basically like everything it was before, like you said, but on steroids. So if someone is interacting with, an LLM or a language model, they are doing it to extract knowledge from them. And so if that's the purpose, if that's the whole value, and you can't rely on the output, you have a problem. And so, we've talked about different technical methods that organizations are using. In particular, you and I have talked about retrieval augmentation, which I think is super exciting. But from like a risk management perspective, again, it doesn't have to be perfect. There's no world where risk doesn't exist. The question when you're doing this in a company is, how much risk can you reduce? And then once you've reduced it, how are you managing the risk that's kind of left over? And so you want to be thinking about what can you do technically, but also like we talked about, and this is why it's awkward, this like divide between product and UI and data science. You want to look at what's in the UI. So usually in best practices, there should be some type of disclaimer that says you're interacting with an AI system. This is a generative AI system. It may, under certain circumstances, provide information that is, incorrect. Here are the things you can do to verify, something like that. And so some disclaimer like that is going to really, really reduce the ability of these regulatory agencies to say you did something wrong. And it's going to let users know that, there's a limit to how much they should rely on these systems. So,
or the system itself documents, rationalizes how they came up with the answer, right? So with footnotes or something like that, links to external sources. Basically, I guess this goes into the whole area of almost explaining how they came up with the answer.
Yeah, although, and this is just, I don't know, like
so this would become almost every answer becomes like a legal document. You lawyers, man, the footnotes sometimes are 3/4 of the page,
I mean, I love a good footnote. So I'll just share this personal anecdote because I think it's super interesting. So as you know, I write a lot of articles, and I'm always interested in like how the articles are being received. And so back when Twitter was, not, or X, whatever, when it was a different beast, I would just kind of get a sense of how articles are being received on Twitter. Those days are over. And so in the last couple of months, I've taken to using like GPT and Bard and others to say, what are people saying about, this article or whatever it is? We could do it with this podcast once it's live. And the answers were very believable. And then I started noticing that something was odd about them. And so I would say, tell me, give me cites to each of these, the blogs you're referencing or whatever. And as I asked for more and more citations, it became clear that almost all of it was wrong. And so the thing that I have found interesting is trying to get those footnotes themselves. Like the footnotes were subject to hallucinations. And that to me was like a pretty big
well, I think so, as I understand what you're saying. So if you write in the prompt, provide some footnotes, it may actually end up just making up the footnotes.
Yeah, so it would
But
be like
if the system is somehow designed to only output something where they can actually have legitimate footnotes, maybe that's a different thing, right? So
yeah, so I guess right now, I guess my point is that I haven't seen systems like that yet. But if you could have systems like that where the footnotes are actual footnotes, like it's XAI that actually makes sense with the right references, I think that would go a very, very long way. Although the only people that will read those are going to be the nerds like like me. So
I think now what exists, Andrew, so it doesn't apply to the entire internet the way Google does, in the sense that, okay, so when you write a search query in Google, it'll give you some results, and then obviously you can click on each result and verify whether or not it's true. So what exists, so that doesn't exist in kind of the generative AI sense yet, for the most part. But what exists is if you say, okay, so here's a bunch of documents or pages, using only these documents and pages, answer these questions and, cite which document or which page you got it from. I think that's possible. If you give it like a universe of things to look at,
you have to
and
give it a limited universe.
tell me what page for each answer, cite the page and the document that you got it from. That's
Yeah.
doable. But
Yeah.
if you give it like the entire, web, I think that's not, I haven't seen that done well yet. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so, like, from my perspective, so there's like what is possible, which I think is what we're talking about. And then from my perspective, it's like, okay, what is actually being implemented? And I think that strategy, if it was implemented widely, would do a huge amount to reduce risk. From a practical standpoint, though, I don't actually know what impact it would have, again, because there aren't that many people who are going to really want to read the footnotes. And just one point, we see this over and over again, which is that we see a lot of data scientists say, like, risk is not my problem. Like, other people do risk management, think about risk. And we see others, actually, like, C-suite level folks at some of our clients, and some not our clients, basically say, this system is really, really, really valuable. It's going to change the way you do, whatever, XYZ. But just don't worry about the risks. Like, the risks are kind of a side note. And I think what our point is, and trying to get clients ready for laws and oversight, is that the more valuable the system is, the higher the risks. There's a direct relationship between the value people are getting from the system and the risks it's creating. And so that's the right metric to think about how much resources should be put into managing bad things that could go wrong. Anyway, I'll stop at that. But like, we see this, it's a weird asymmetry where people say, like, this is the greatest product, bet the company, whatever. So the value of this thing is really, really high. It's going to transform, whatever it is. But then they say, but if something goes wrong, it's fine. Like, it's just a hallucination. It doesn't matter. This is going to revolutionize the way customers interact with us. But if it's wrong, just forget about it.
Everything depends on the use case, right? So you can treat hallucination the way we often hear people talk about self-driving cars, right? So it's not going to be accident-free, but it'll cause less accidents. So same thing, I guess, is how people talk about these systems, for example, in the context of technical customer support, right? So it might give you the wrong answer for certain technical questions, but it might be more correct than the average human technical customer support person. But it depends on the context. Maybe that one mistake by the system is enough to torpedo your stock price, right?
Yeah.
So everything is context specific, right?
So I have two thoughts on that point, and tell me if I'm going on too long here. But number one, that is something that I think is already true in the healthcare space. There are all these really, really interesting studies. I just saw one in the Lancet the other day, like one of the premier medical journals on interpreting results, I think, of mammograms. Anyway, it's basically true right now in the healthcare setting, but these systems hallucinate. And so on the whole, like, from a societal perspective, yes, that's right. Statistically, you're going to have more people with better results. But now say that, and who here would voluntarily say, I don't want a good human doctor. I just want to.
Same thing with self-driving cars, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not, and so it is just, for whatever reason, we're going to want the best human doctors and not, the least worst.
I guess at the end of the day, it's always, good to think of these systems and humans as not either or, but kind of a combination of the two is always the best, right? So
exactly, yeah. And okay, so one other thing. This is what I'm gonna ask you to.
And by the way, Andrew, you can look at chess, for example, right? So chess beat humans long time ago, but then now it's clear that even a kind of subpar chess program with a human can beat the best chess program, right?
Yeah,
so the combination of human and machine is better, right? So
yeah, I heard this one. I mean, this is kind of cheesy, but There's AI, artificial intelligence, and then IA, intelligence augmentation.
Right.
And so the thought, and I think it's true, is that these systems are best used actually for IA, for intelligence augmentation. And so you use two types of intelligence. But I'll just share this kind of one story because I think it's super interesting. I think you know about this. One of the things we've been doing at Luminos.Law is AI incident response tabletop exercises. We get executive senior people into a room. We do like 90 minutes of, this is very common in information security. We'll do a tabletop. This thing goes wrong. What do you do? This goes wrong. We've been doing that with InQtel, and it has been fascinating to see the results. And one of the very interesting things that we've seen is some people just say, you know, an incident happened, the AI was wrong, it caused some harm, but that's AI today. That's generative AI systems. It'll get better with time. We just kind of have to suck it up. You know, here's an incident. We shouldn't overreact. We shouldn't do anything because these systems will get better as they're adopted more. I think that is wrong. I do not think that is good. I don't think laws or regulators are going to accept that. But I bring it up because it's an incredibly interesting point to make when you are managing risks. And I think people say similar things about self-driving cars.
So, Andrew, looking at this mind map that I did from the FTC complaint to OpenAI, is this something that companies should look at, or do you recommend the NIST risk management framework? So is there something useful here as you look at it that I guess a lot of this, if you implement the NIST AI risk management framework, which you folks at Luminos.Law helped create, is that enough to make this, to answer a lot of these questions here?
So, all right, a couple points. So yes, the NIST, it's called the AI RMF, the AI risk management framework.
Which
That's something that
which I will also show here.
Cool. Yeah. So that is really, in our view, the best thing you can do to both manage risk and to, excuse me, and to demonstrate that you're kind of complying with best practices.
And so you think that will cover this? For the most part. For the most part, right?
Well, so start with the RMF, but there are certain details in that mind map that you just had that are not directly addressed by the RMF. The RMF is like the umbrella, but then you have to go in and add some of these details. So it's kind of do both. But that being said, the FTC, this mind map is, I think it is
the kitchen sink
more than is necessary. Yeah, that's the kitchen sink. And so what you really want to do, and this is a lot of what we spend our time doing at Luminos.Law, is you want to be pretty strategic, because the truth is that most organizations can't do all this. They'd have to hire a lot of people. I mean, OpenAI can, you know, Google can, the biggest organizations can, but even the medium-sized, you know, generative AI companies, like, this is not reasonable to ask of them. So it's a little bit of an art form trying to understand exactly, you know, what you want to focus on. And there's one thing I know this is a podcast, so it doesn't really make sense. I'm going to share a link in the chat here. It just works. So some folks at Stanford looked at all the big generative AI systems, and they did a map. They actually did a table of compliance with the EU AI Act. And in terms of, you know, compliance, data source disclosure, data governance, compute, capabilities and limitations, all of these things. And it's just helpful. It's basically like a scorecard, and it's helpful to understand how these things match up. But if you're in the US, the FTC and NIST are way more important. So I just mentioned that as one reference point.
But there's clearly a, you know, what all of these frameworks, NIST and this mind map communicate to me is there seems to be some level of rethinking about how we approach these projects. And I don't know if you're familiar with, you know, there's a group of economists who study big projects, right? So over time, right? So whatever the California high-speed train, you know, the bridges, and so they have databases of all these massive projects. So they have kind of best practices as to what to do to make sure that they succeed. And so I think one of the kind of the most concise way of summarizing their key piece of advice is think slow, act fast. So this means, you know, you do detailed planning before you embark on executing the project, right?
I mean,
so
that is
it's
very different.
basically very much the reverse of the move fast, break things, right?
That is exactly what I was going to say. Those two things like can't really go hand in hand.
So do you think there's a bit of a rethink that people need to do in terms of, you know, because there obviously there's a temptation because these tools are getting easy to use, and you know you're worried about getting disrupted by your startups or even your competitors. But it seems to me the findings from this field, which also, by the way, they have a lot in their database. They have a lot of IT projects too, big IT projects. So this whole think slow, act fast mentality may map over here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that dichotomy, the move fast and break things versus think slow and act fast. Because when you think about risk and when you think about what can go wrong, it's just very easy to say, don't do this, you know, don't do it, slow down. And I would say most people, I mean, this is kind of sad to say, but I think it's true. Most people in the risk management community, most people who get paid to like figure out what can go wrong, really over-index on slow down, prevent the bad things from happening, and it leaves people who are, you know, worried about moving fast, business people, people who have to, you know, hit their numbers. It leaves them very frustrated, especially with lawyers. There are a lot of people that just ignore what lawyers have to say because, you know, they think the incentives are misaligned. So it's really difficult to find that right balance of, okay, innovate, move fast, but, you know, limit the harm you could do. And so I don't actually think, I think both of those phrases are an extreme. And
but there's I guess one attractive thing about that. I mean, I don't think you have to. I don't think they are meant to literally be actually go very slow. But I think what it communicates to me is have some planning up front for and to some extent that's what you've been telling us and the listeners for a long time, which is document.
Yeah.
So to the extent that if you document, that slows you down, right? And then that shows you how things can go wrong in some ways, right? So
yeah, I mean, I would say, okay, at minimum, do not ignore. Like no one can afford to ignore, and no one should be able to ignore things that can go wrong. And so, like at minimum, we do see a lot of people who are focused on innovating and moving fast, just completely say, this is not my problem. You know, we're not going to think about it. And so that I think is extremely clear. I think it's the right thing to do. Laws are requiring it. You need to stop and say, what could go wrong? How am I addressing it? And you need to document that. So like that is true. When I'm thinking of that phrase, the think slow, act fast, I can't remember. There's a really interesting software discipline on basically creating error-free code. And I think it was used in some like space shuttle stuff and some aviation. There's actually, I've spent a lot of time over the years, like,
is this formal verification?
yeah, maybe. I can't remember. I've spent way too much time on the Wikipedia page, which is like way too in depth every 6 months or a year. Maybe it's formal verification. I can't remember.
I mean, basically, in this context, it's you know, trying to identify potential problems early on, and figure out how to mitigate some of those problems. By the way, there's a version of this think slow, act fast from the military, which you might like, which is slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
Yep.
So, but so what is the what kind of rethinking should teams do in light of generative AI? So you've talked about documentation, but there also seems to be some organizational shifts, right? So this whole you really need cross-functional teams from the get-go. It sounds like, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what is true for generative AI systems to like specifically for your question for this podcast. So what I think is the most important thing, and maybe the most interesting, is that the risks there's just no way to prevent bad stuff from happening with generative AI. And so what that means is rather than prevention, response is really important. You want to be able to detect things when they go wrong. And that also means that testing is, I think, way, way, way more important with generative AI systems than it is with traditional AI systems. And so that's actually something we do a lot. We're doing a lot.
So how does that translate in concrete terms to things that you think people should consider doing more of? And Andrew, this could be things like should they be doing more red teaming? Should they be doing more tabletop exercises?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so it's like you said, it starts with documentation. And the reason why I'm like a little hesitant to say that is because that's true for all AI, but you need to document and standardize the way you think about and manage risks. So you just need a document everybody uses.
So is that the documentation thing that's clear in the NIST RMF?
Yes, that's clear in the NIST RMF. So once you have standardized forms and templates and documentation, then to go back to generative AI specifically, you apply those to testing. So like we're doing a lot of this. How do you test these systems? How is it standardized? How do you capture the input when you're doing prompt engineering? How do you capture the output? We're actually seeing a lot of really interesting stuff with use of public data sets and adversarial models for these types of testing. But just testing for risks, red teaming, is just becoming way, way, way more important with generative AI systems. And so what we've seen, and especially in the early days, which is crazy to think that like that was like 4 months ago. Now we're, in the medium days. In the earliest days, we saw testing at big tech companies and others. It was really just a mess. They would say, let's get 50 people, throw everything you've got at the system, write it down.
That's basically how testing is done in large companies, especially large companies like to say we have an advantage because we have a lot of people who can test the system.
You can just throw stuff and okay, so we saw that I'd say 4 months ago, 5 months ago. With the clients we're working with, that's no longer the case. There are standardized testing plans, standardized documentation. There are a whole host of ways you can test strategies, I should say, that you can use to test these systems. And so what we help them do is say, here are 15 strategies. Use one test from each strategy, and then document it. And then what did we learn? And so
Andrew, so one thing that seems common between this NIST RMF and this FTC mind map that I created is, you need to understand the people involved. So the documentation applies to who's doing what.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
so it seems like obviously teams know that, but they never write it down, right?
I mean, never writing it down is the problem. There's so much movement and development. I can't tell you the number of times we've been involved where some AI system has an issue.
Like for example, this box here, personal information handling, right? So steps taken to prevent personal information from being included in the training data. It seems to me, not only do you document that, you have to kind of say who did that.
Yeah, who did it,
and how did they do it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, what are the 5 W's? Who, what, when?
Yeah.
How? I think that the thing that is striking.
So that that kind of attention to that level of detail seems to be missing. And so what you're saying is that generative AI makes attention to detail even more paramount.
Yeah, it makes attention to detail even more paramount. But it also, I'm trying to like express this in a way that makes sense. But all of the things that were true about AI risks before in traditional AI systems, I think are like exacerbated. They're made more intense by generative AI systems. And so one of the things, and I think we've talked about some of the stuff I've written with Dan Geer, who I think is wonderful. We talked about the old paradigm for risk management being mean time between failures. So you basically want to make the time between bad things happening as large as possible. So you're focused on eliminating failures, basically,
Right.
And that no longer works. Instead, what you want to do is make as small as you can the mean time to repair. So how quickly can you figure out this bad thing happened, and then how quickly can you fix it? And like that, I think, is the model we're moving to with language models. So it involves testing, it involves those disclaimers, it involves user feedback. This answer was helpful. This answer was like heinously incorrect. It involves all the types of monitoring post-deployment mechanisms you can, because these things are going to fail. They're going to say wrong stuff. Yeah, I don't know.
And it seems like also these services, you know, are clearly, we're still in the early phases. They seem to do a few basic things, but I think there's going to be the notion of end-to-end applications in this realm too, in the following sense. So for example, imagine yourself using one of these systems to write a paragraph, right? So you don't want to take that paragraph and copy and paste it to yet another system to check whether or not that's plagiarized. So you want the system that you're using to generate that paragraph to do that itself. And over time, I think we'll see more of these end-to-end applications. So I guess in closing, to our listeners, I think the best resource is really Luminos.Law. Just go to the website. They have a bunch of reading materials, but also if you want them to do the audits, they can do that for you. And they're obviously aware of all the legal regulations. They've worked with chief legal counsels, all the top companies, including top tech companies, use Luminos.Law. So they have the experience, and they're now increasingly doing more and more in this generative AI space. And with that,
I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you for that plug. But yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of resources on this. And one thing I'll just say to the listeners here is that we find this to be extremely fascinating and interesting, but everyone is struggling with this. Like, you know, the developers of foundational models to companies adopting them to, you know, small startups, which is part of what makes it so interesting and fun. But this is an area that is really evolving kind of very quickly.
and with that, thank you, Andrew.